Dark Elves. The Dark Elf campaign is a complicated one at the moment. It functions around a slave economy where you can acquire slaves through combat and then they can buff up a bunch of your economic stats, but it will hurt your public order, so then after a while you might have to purge some slave rebellions. They also have Black Arcs, so they're a pseudo-pirate faction. It is largely about empire building like most of the Order factions, even though they themselves are a destruction faction. They're not good guys. You're going to play as the bad guy. You're going to have some emo death metal playing for most of the campaign. They have a pretty... They have a good amount of lords, but little variety in how they play. A lot of them want to do similar things, except for Malice has a pretty unique campaign. Overall, Dark Elves are interesting. I struggle with their campaigns at times, because a lot of their monsters are pretty bad. Now, that could change in the future, but for now, you'll end up spamming a lot of the same Dark Shards and Bleak Swords and Dread Spears to get through most of the game. Summon some cool monsters, and then just auto-resolve with them, because if you actually play the battle, you'll lose them. Dark Elves are weird, but fun enough. Dark Elves in multiplayer have a wide variety of lords that want to do a bunch of different things on the battlefield. You have foot duelists, you have, mixed duelist hybrid caster people. Malakith is very expensive, but he can be worth his salt. Unfortunately for them, they have a couple lores of magic that are okay, but they usually default to the lore of Dark. It is their lore, but you need it for Soul Stealer to heal up, usually your Lord, who will be expensive and your key to victory. They are a little bit pigeonholed in not being able to be too creative with their spells at a higher level of play. As for their heroes, the heroes are also quite weak in combat. Most of them are overpriced. Infantry, also not the best in combat. Could argue they're overpriced, but you're not going to rely on your infantry to win you the game. They have some decent mid-tier infantry in the Witch Elves and the Sisters of Slaughter, but at the high levels, they suffer a bit unless you're in a very specific matchup. As for the missile infantry, this is where we start to say some good things. Shades in the right hands can be rather good, and all of their missiles are armor-piercing except for the Corsair handbows, which is their 360 skirmisher. So you can really surprise some factions if they're not used to dealing with armor-piercing missiles that cost you 550 or 600. Also, silver-shielded missile infantry can win a lot of duels with other archers. That is nice. They also have excellent light cavalry and Dark Riders, and decent Cold One Knights, though they do need to counter something specific because their stats aren't particularly high, heavily relying on armor-piercing anti-large to get through the day. They have okay chariots, but they are hybrid. They're not as... They imply they're skirmish chariots, but they run out of ammunition very quickly. They're actually meant to be used for both. And their monsters largely are overpriced, way too tall, and die too easily to arrows, as their artillery and war machines are also pretty bad. Reaper Bolt Throwers get a job done, but they're not great. If you're playing as Dark Elves, you have a little bit of Demons of Chaos usually, where your Lord is going to have to do a lot of the carrying for you. As I mentioned earlier, your hero options are rather trash. They're just too squishy for how expensive they are and what they can do in most cases, and your roster has no access to healing to help them out. This is the same problem that the monsters have. Expensive, you have no access to healing to help them out. The only monster that does have healing is the frickin' Hydra, and its leadership is so low, it'll rout most of the time as it's getting its heal proc. So you usually want to stick to Manticores just because they're cheap, chipper, and they'll get done when you need to get done. So as Dark Elves, you need your Lord, and you need your cavalry to carry you through most fights, sometimes your missile infantry. You're kind of Bretonia, but evil. Kind of. Your infantry aren't as dog shit, but they're also way more expensive. So if you want an infantry rush, you better know what you're doing. They can sometimes infantry rush low leadership factions. Beastmen aren't great because their cavalry is so good against you, but, I don't know. You could infantry rush Bretonia and maybe get away with it. Maybe. You better know what you're doing. Witch Elves are an also interesting piece if you're playing as Dark Elves. One of the biggest things about them is this Rampage. It can screw over some guys who want to, cycle charge. Like Tomb Kings. In the Tomb Kings matchup, you might want a Witch Elves or two, because if they charge a Chariot into your front line and a Witch Elf gets a little proc on them, the Chariot stops, the Chariot dies. Largely, your game will be won through either keeping your Dark Shards alive and shooting, or your cavalry flanks, or both. But usually you want one or the other to try and win you the game. If you're playing against Dark Elves, grind them, honestly. Just out-grind them. Dark Elves suck at really staying in the fight and just churning through chaff. Tons and tons of chaff. So if you can throw a ton of bodies at them, the Dark Elves will start to struggle. You might want a powerful Duelist Lord or an Evasive Lord, though. If you have a immobile not very good at Combat Lord, they will punish you with either Malice or Marathi or Manticores or Malakith diving onto that target and killing it. So you'll want a fast Lord or a Lord that just wants to take the fight with them. That seems pretty fine. Skirmish Cav against the Dark Elves also is generally good. As with most Elven factions, they're so expensive, every dead elf really hurts them. And their counter Skirmish Cav is not 360 in their Dark Riders of Pewter Crossbows, so you can just chase them down and throw, missiles at them while they run away. If they counter skirmish you with their Scourger and Chariots, they'll run out of ammo rather quickly, and in the long run, you'll win the skirmish game. So, either throw chaff at them or skirmish them. If you take elite stuff, you might be in for a bad time.
Roar! Subscribe, yes, yes.